Today with us we have Beth Cooper from the Senate Banking Committee with Ranking Member Sherrod Brown from Ohio, Clinton Jones from the House Financial Services Committee with Chairman Jeb Hensarling from Texas, Jason Woolwine from the Senate Appropriations Committee with Susan Collins from Maine, Theresa Dumais from the House Financial Services Committee from Maxine Waters' office, and Artie Mandel from Senator Maria Cantwell's office from Washington State. So we can, that's all. So we can jump right ahead. We'll start with tax reform, if that's okay. So it seems like the dynamic has really changed in the last couple of weeks. Obamacare, the repeal didn't get through, and in two ways that might have complicated tax reform. One, it shows some deep divisions within the Republican Party, and two, some of the savings that they were anticipating to come out of that repeal aren't available anymore for tax reform. What do you think is possible in tax reform in the year ahead, given those limitations?
Yeah, the failure of the health care bill just makes the math a lot harder if they still want to do a big comprehensive tax reform bill. There are about $900 billion in tax cuts they would have been able to pass without finding offsetting revenue that now, if they still want to get the corporate rates down to 20 or 15% as the original Trump tax reform plan called for, it means you have to find a lot more savings in other parts of the tax code. So what does that mean going forward? Well, there's certainly a lot more energy around tax reform. It's the next priority of the administration. They're having meetings, they're talking about what a plan could look like, but in terms of concrete detail, we really don't know a lot about what the White House thinks and what their position is and some of the more controversial ideas that the House Republicans have been advancing. So I expect a lot of that uncertainty will, crystallize over the next couple of weeks. The budget that came out was only the appropriations, discretionary side. It didn't include what would normally be in an administration's budget, a whole big tax section with, very detailed proposals, a green book. And we're supposedly getting a new budget in the next couple of weeks, and maybe there'll be some more clarity on what the administration thinks there. They've, through the press, they've said, we want to drive this process. I think they feel a little bit like they were behind the ball on the health care bill thing and not as involved in the development of that policy as they wanted to be. And so some of the reports we're seeing now is that they're going to drive the train, I believe is the phrase that they decided to use. But I don't think that's going to stop Chairman Brady and the Speaker over in the House, who've been working on this for a long time and have their own ideas. And so, so over here in the Senate, we're just kind of sitting around waiting at this point to see what happens, but and whether or not there's going to be an opportunity to do something big.
So do you think it changes the likelihood that we'll see something go through on reconciliation where they would only need 51 votes from Republicans, or do you think it means we're more likely to see a bipartisan bill?
Well, right now, the reconciliation is still on the table. They have this instruction out there that they didn't use for the health care bill, so that's one potential vehicle. And if we do an FY18 budget resolution, that was kind of the original plan, was to use that instruction for tax reform. That's going to make it very hard to do bipartisan tax reform bill just in general. The reconciliation process is kind of inherently partisan, and if that's the term of the debate, I think there's going to be a lot of reluctance from Democrats to want to make compromises if the path forward is going to be only reconciliation.
Yeah, and a lot of the research that the National Low-Income Housing Coalition has put out shows that the greatest need for affordable housing is among people who have extremely low incomes. And we wanted to thank the Senator Cantwell, for introducing her bill that would expand the low-income housing tax credit and provide incentives so that it's easier to serve or create developments that serve extremely low-income people. And so I wanted to give you the opportunity maybe to talk a little bit about that bill and what sorts of changes it includes that would help the people that in this room are working with and serving.
Sure. So we reintroduced that bill about a month ago, beginning of March. We're up to, I think, 15 bipartisan co-sponsors, including Chairman Hatch, the chairman of the Finance Committee, and a couple other members of the Finance Committee. And we've got a nice balanced roster so far that we're hoping to add to. So thanks, everybody in this room, for your advocacy and when you're meeting with members and talking with people for for helping us build the kind of support we're going to need to get this thing included in an infrastructure bill, tax reform, really whatever vehicle that we have available. There's kind of three big policies and then a whole bunch of other smaller ones. The biggest one is obviously a 50% increase in the LIHTC allocation, 9% allocation phased in over 5 years. So just more resources out there to build more housing. The second is last year, or 2015, we got the 9% floor for the credit made permanent. We weren't able to get the 4% floor for rehabilitation made permanent, but we do have that in this bill for both rehabilitation and bond finance projects. So again, just more equity to those deals, making more projects feasible and hopefully leading to more development of affordable housing. And then the third big provision is this income averaging provision that a lot of folks have been working on, where we're going to let projects have some flexibility in who the individual units are targeted to. So you can target some a little bit higher up the scale, and as long as the average is still 60% of AMI, you can have some projects targeted lower down the income scale. So making more projects specifically targeted at low-income individuals financially feasible is a big priority for my boss. There's a whole bunch of other provisions. You mentioned the 50% basis boost for ELI projects. We have a big, in Washington State right now, like a lot of other states along the West Coast, a big homelessness crisis. And this is something that my boss is very focused on addressing and wants to be able to, and wants the low-income housing tax credit to continue to be a tool, an effective tool for meeting that challenge.
And so a lot of our, the people in the audience are going to the Hill tomorrow to meet with their members of Congress. What can they be doing, whether in those meetings or when they're back at home, to help support the provisions that are in those bills?
Well, I think it's just important to always, when you're talking about this program, it's always been a bipartisan program. It was created in 1986. President Reagan, was president when this was signed into law. It's always been a bipartisan program. It's a public-private partnership. So you have the private sector coming to the table with affordable housing advocates and with government to get these units built. That structure allows for a lot of efficiencies in terms of overhead, and these are things that appeal to different types of members. The cost savings that come from developing these projects in other parts of the federal government and the jobs that they create when the projects are built. Every member has a different thing that they care about the most, and so these are some of the things that we try to talk about when we're talking about the bill. But I think by far the most effective way to get support is to invite members to go see these projects when they're back home in their districts, and show them the need and how this project is meeting that needs.
Great. We can move on to appropriations. We spent a lot of time here talking about the president's budget and what that means for housing programs. Diane Yantel put out a press release when it first came out talking about how if these were enacted, they'd be the worst cuts to HUD since the Reagan era, which ushered in an increase in homelessness. It cuts the HUD programs by about 13% or $6 billion, eliminates CDBG, home. The version that was in the Washington Post, at least an earlier version of it, would have cut resources to repair public housing by 2/3, underfunding the Housing Choice Voucher Program by about $1 billion compared to FY17. Everyone has said, at least, that bill is dead on arrival, but that's not great assurance to many of the people in this room who receive housing assistance or rely on that to help make their homes affordable. What do you think's ahead for FY18, and what kind of, can we expect cuts? Could we expect something different? What do you see ahead?
Well, first of all, standard caveats for those of us up here. We've done these panels before, and of course we're speaking on our behalf and not on our members, so nothing we say is gospel. But looking ahead to 18, every president's budget is dead on arrival. Every president's budget is, regardless of administration, is a policy document that highlights priorities that the administration has, and Congress doesn't necessarily have the same priorities, whether it's a Republican administration, Republican Congress, Democratic administration, Democratic Congress. With that in mind, it will be a challenging year. It'll be a challenging year because while we're not necessarily talking about a $54 billion cut, We are talking about the BCA caps, which for FY18 are $3 billion below FY17 for non-defense discretionary. On top of that, there have been advanced appropriations, so future funding has already been enacted for VA healthcare for about $3 billion. So we're starting off the year already about $6 billion below FY17 levels. On top of that, there'll be other priorities. My minority always reminds me that the census needs to get funded, rental assistance needs to get funded, other sort of priorities. So it will be a challenging year, it will be a tough year, and it will be a year where we will certainly start out the discussion trying to write bills to non-defense discretionary levels that are $6 billion below where we are right now. So that isn't necessarily any different from where we've been in prior years and where we will be in future years, the next few years going forward. It is continued downward pressure on HUD programs. The committee has made a priority of trying to maintain existing rental assistance. The committee has made a priority of funding the CDBG program. The committee has tried to hold on to the home program to the best that we can, and we will, I believe, continue to try and do so, but that will largely depend on what kind of an allocation we get, which will largely depend on what sort of a final 18 budget number looks like. So yeah, it's going to be a challenging year, but it won't be anything more wild and crazy than prior years have been. But I do want to stress that we are starting out the year $6 billion below last year.
So we've been living under these spending caps for many years now, and we've seen the downward pressure on the HUD programs. Overall, it's been cut about 8.4% when adjusted for inflation, and we've seen home get cut in half, lots of other resources gone. Do you think, but since that time, we've still seen Congress and the past administration reach agreements to lift the spending caps to provide some sort of relief for defense and non-defense programs.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's still possible, that we could see a lift in the spending caps?
Yeah, anything's possible. Congress works best when it has deadlines. And at the moment, we don't necessarily have a deadline on a 2018 spending agreement or even discussion. What largely needs to happen is that people need to see what has been termed in the past as the parade of horribles. They will need to see what bills we write at these allocation levels, and at that point decide whether or not those funding levels are levels they can live with or not. That generally is what sort of sparks a conversation about we need to talk about the budget caps. So I think you will probably see, at least initially, the House and Senate write 18 bills to the existing budget cap. And then, given the timing, over August recess or whatnot, you will see folks look at those bills, non-defense discretionary committee-wide, and say, I have a concern with that program funding level, or I don't have a concern with that program level, and that will sort of begin the conversation of, if not this funding level, then what funding level, and what budget cap. So yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, we've done budget agreements in the past, and there's no reason we couldn't do another budget agreement in the future.
Mm-hmm. So what would be the best and worst case scenario if there isn't a lift in the spending caps? What could we expect to see? What's in the range of possibility there?
I mean, without having an allocation from my committee, I couldn't sort of tell you what the parade of horribles will look like. But if we continue our current practice of preserving existing rental assistance, that means that if you have a public housing unit right now, if you have a voucher right now, we will try our darndest to make sure there's enough money at the end of the day so that you don't lose that assistance. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that upon turnover, that voucher gets reissued. Same thing with the homeless programs. Same thing with any of the rental assistance programs. We do our darndest to hold on to CDBG, but there aren't that many big pots of money out there where, depending on our allocation, we could make cuts. The home program has been on thin ice for a number of years, continues to be on thin ice. Not necessarily because of the program design, but just because of what members perceive as the level of support for various programs. And they certainly hear a lot about CDBG and not necessarily as much about home, although the last year or two have been different. But I mean, I think if one were sort of looking for a parade of horribles, it would be where one has seen those sort of cuts happen before, whether in actual bills or in just sort of discussion as we look at sort of what sequestration funding levels might look like.
So unlike the tax bills that we've been talking about that can get through with just 50 votes any appropriations bill still has to get through 60 votes in the Senate. Do you think that there's an appetite among your colleagues on the other side of the aisle to filibuster? Do you think, how much energy do you perceive from your Democratic colleagues about pushing back on those spending bills?
Well, I think it will largely depend on what the bills look like. I mean, what we're talking about are budget caps that Republicans and Democrats have voted for before. They are enacted. They have been what we've all signed on to before. We didn't necessarily think we'd have to live with them, but they're where we're at. So might Democrats object to current funding levels under those bills? Sure. But that assumes that these bills actually sort of see floor action in the near future. What we're talking about is a full president's budget that doesn't come up till sometime in May, mid-May, late May, somewhere in that range. It has been long-standing House and Senate Appropriations Committee practice and desire to finish their bills in full committee before August recess. With roughly 30 legislative days between sort of mid-May and August recess, there's not a lot of floor time that's out there, nor is there a lot of time for, after committees mark up their bills, to sort of go to the floor. You're looking at a week or two. So I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see a lot of bills go to the floor on the Senate side. On the House side, I think it's a little different. But certainly on the Senate side, you may not see bills actually go to the floor this year before August recess, at which point there's no reason to filibuster if there's no floor time to talk about them.
And one of the things you mentioned is that when the bills come out of committee, and if and when they have very deep cuts to housing programs, that's usually when members of Congress respond to the list of deplorables, as you mentioned. But are there specific members of Congress that you think are most sympathetic to the cuts to HUD that we should be targeting, or if we want to see an increase in housing funding?
I don't know that one necessarily wants to target their sympathetic folks so much as their unsympathetic folks. I mean, you know, it's always nice to talk to your friends, but you've got to talk to people who aren't your friends if you want to talk about different numbers. To that extent, when groups come in and talk to us on the subcommittee, we're at the end of the process. It starts with the budget committee. So if groups aren't talking to House and Senate leadership, if they're not talking to the budget committees, then by the time it gets to us and we're dealing with how to best make an allocation work, the conversation is too late to change the allocation. So that's really where the conversation needs to happen. And much like the Appropriations Committee right now is juggling FY17 and FY18, I assume that other committees are very capable of doing the same thing. And I would assume the Budget Committee, as much as it's talking about 17 still, is probably very much behind the scenes working on 18.
Moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit about the threats and the opportunities for the Housing Trust Fund. One of the threats we see is in the appropriations process where, you know, if there are deep cuts to the HUD budget, we might see what happened in FY15 where the House swept up the funding from the Housing Trust Fund and used it to plug holes in the HUD budget. I suspect that if we're seeing deep cuts or if there are threats of deep cuts, we might see that again. I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yep. I mean, you know, as we talk about hypotheticals without having an idea of sort of what kind of numbers we're working with, yeah, I would not expect to see anything different in terms of 18. I mean, budget games that we have all played before, whether from the administration or the congressional perspective, I would expect to see played again in 18.
Great. Moving on to infrastructure spending, the president ran his campaign promising a $1 trillion investment in infrastructure. Recently, Senate Democrats came out with their own plan of what a $1 trillion plan could look like. We were really pleased to see that it included about $110 billion for revitalizing main streets, which would have allowed some of that money to go towards building affordable housing infrastructure. I thought maybe, Beth, you could talk a little bit about that and what was included in that plan.
Sure. Actually on. Hello? All right, I'll just shout. All right, hi? Does that work? I'm on. Thank you, sir. Okay, hello, I'm Beth. I work for the Banking Committee for Ranking Member Brown, and gosh.
Is that that better?
Am I good? Okay. All right. All right, that sounds good. I'm Beth. I work for the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, and I work on the Housing and Urban Affairs section of that. So before talking about infrastructure, which I like to do, just for a minute, I think when you're doing your Hill visits, the Banking Committee is not on the appropriations side of things, providing money, but I think hopefully we'd like to make Jason's job as easy as possible by giving him as much money to work with as possible. So I'd like to just echo his comments about talking to members now when you're doing your visits about the importance of the budget resolution. It's really arcane. I say that as a former staffer for the Budget Committee, and my family still has no idea what I did for those years. But it is arcane, but it's also important in setting the limits that he and his colleagues will have to work within for your program. So really important. I know NLIHC does a good job of translating budget mumbo jumbo into English. So, all right, that's my plug on that. On infrastructure, yes, we do have the Senate Democrats noticed and heard this. President Trump did campaign on the idea of $1 trillion infrastructure investment package. So far, we have not seen a package come from the administration sort of outlining their ideas. So the Senate Democrats put forward a plan, a $1 trillion investment blueprint, an outline, and $110 billion of that would be devoted to Main Streets, which is housing and community development. And that was just done in the recognition of what you all know, that we have a crying need for affordable housing in this country, that we need to fix the affordable housing that we've got, and we need to create more. Also, our cities need investment. We're talking about economic development efforts at the neighborhood level, revitalizing blighted properties, either bringing them back or get rid of them if we need to. Some of the other things that we've highlighted are the need to put more money into remediating lead, which is still poisoning so many kids in many neighborhoods, particularly in older communities where we have older housing from before 1978, bless you. So those are all things we'd like to see in an infrastructure package. So far, we haven't, as I said, we haven't seen anything come from the administration with their outlines. As part of his confirmation process, my boss, Senator Brown from Ohio, asked now Secretary Carson whether he would support housing in an infrastructure package, and he said he would. And I've seen press reports that he has mentioned that. I don't think we would regard that as a substitute for a good, healthy, regular budget. We would intend this as new investment above what's needed to maintain our properties, but it's good that he's talking about housing and infrastructure, I think.
He actually mentioned that today in his speech during lunchtime with us, talking about an investment in infrastructure, and maybe that being a place where housing could also be seen as. But for you and Artie, do you think there's a way that infrastructure could be tied to tax reform? I know that's something we've heard as of last week from the president, talking about maybe trying to reach out to more Democrats. Is that a hook that you think we might see?
Well, I think there's always been talk about how you could use some of the revenues raised from tax reform to pay for an increase in infrastructure spending. That was a proposal that was in President Obama's budget, his last couple of budgets. Essentially, the concept being that when you make a lot of changes to the tax code, a lot of those changes are one-time revenues that are being raised. The most prominent one being all of the money that many corporations have currently permanently reinvested offshore is the technical term. But when those revenues are repatriated back here, they will generate revenue, but it's not a sustainable revenue stream. It's just a one-time thing. So the concept being that you could use those monies for new investments instead of using them to permanently lower tax rates, which would lead to some long-term revenue issues. There's not consensus amongst this. There are many folks on the other side of the aisle who support using those revenues for tax reform, and there have been some conversations in the past about using, coming up with some kind of deal where part of that could finance an infrastructure bill. But I think that this is one area that, we've been talking about for a while. We put out our plan, $1 trillion of real infrastructure spending. We had a proposal, the president's proposal during the campaign was for $1 trillion, but it was through a tax credit bond idea that works for some projects but doesn't necessarily work for others. So, I mean, we love tax credits, obviously, in housing. They work for housing, but they probably don't work for other types of infrastructure. So, this is, I think, a priority for us. And whether it goes with tax reform or not, I think, it's a bigger conversation as to, the type of approach the administration takes on this, if they try to go through reconciliation and do a bill, or if this is one of those areas that we can get something done in a bipartisan way. So.
That's definitely something that we're paying attention to, and it seems like it goes in and out of whether or not people think it might happen or not. But either way, we're starting to do a lot of work on our end to try to talk about affordable housing as infrastructure, and we're actually working with Senator Merkley, who's going to be introducing a bill to talk about the Housing Trust Fund as a piece for affordable housing infrastructure, and you'll hear about that more soon, hopefully. But moving on to GSE reform, so if you all recall, the last housing finance reform bill that was working its way through the Senate included a provision that would have expanded the Housing Trust Fund to about $3 billion a year. Congress didn't cross the finish line with that, but there's a lot of interest among the chairman and the ranking member to start addressing that process again. And so I was wondering if you could give us a little background about where things are now and what your members' priorities are for GSE reform.
Okay. Where are you? When are you going to deliver yours?
This is for Beth, Clinton, and Theresa.
Oh, well, I thought you were asking Beth. And,
No. Well, I'll go first. I'll go first. I'm trying to draw straws. So housing finance reform is obviously a big topic. It's 1/5 or $1 trillion of the economy of the economy is tied up in housing. So it's obviously a big task and pretty complicated. In our committee, our chairman is Mike Crapo from Idaho, and I've already agreed to Jason's stipulation that I'm not speaking for my boss, so I certainly won't speak for someone else's. But he has said that GSE reform is something he'd like to look at. On our committee, we've begun some bipartisan meetings and briefings on the topic to really kind of get to the bottom of the topic and everything that's necessary. Basically, I think where my boss has come out before is saying, well, first, is very supportive of the Housing Trust Fund in any sort of GSE reform context, but also sort of as first principles trying to decide what we want the system to do so that there is access to affordable credit for credit-worthy borrowers, whether that's homeowners or people who are seeking to do affordable multifamily housing. I think his objective would be to outline what we want the system to achieve and then to work toward that. So the discussions are really just beginning. There's a lot of work that was done a couple of years ago, and we can draw from that, but new folks available, people have done more thinking, so really at the start of things.
all right, well,
And on the House side, is your mic not working?
He's good.
it'll work in a minute.
There
Okay,
you
hi.
go.
My name is Clinton Jones. I'm the lead staffer for the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee of the Committee on Financial Services, House of Representatives side. Chairman Jeb Hensling is our full committee chair. And at the subcommittee level, it's Sean Duffy from Wisconsin. And I'll just piggyback on Jason's disclaimer that these are my opinions and not the official opinions of the chair of the committee. So let me answer it a different kind of way. We have a set of priorities for the committee this year, and the first and foremost is moving flood insurance. And we're spending 95% of our time right now on flood insurance, and then we will move to what we call the Choice Act, which will address some of the deregulatory issues with Dodd-Frank. Our subcommittee only has one title in that particular bill. So it's the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee, and we're spending a lot of time on the insurance and not a whole lot of time on housing right now. What I suspect is that we will then pivot after those two items are clear, that we would pivot then to housing finance reform. And I don't expect that to happen really till midsummer or early fall. So there has not been a lot of thought into the strategy and what the package could look like. I think a good indicator is the PATH Act that the committee passed, I think, 2.5 years ago. Now, for this subcommittee, we did not have jurisdiction over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac GSEs. This Congress, the subcommittee, after 20 years, has now taken back that jurisdiction, and so the staff has to not only learn about the FHA provisions, but all the other provisions in the PATH Act, since we will be the lead in moving that particular bill. But to be honest, it's just not on the battleground right now. It's something that I think it's in the back of our mind. We have some ideas, and we've already put forth some ideas in previous Congresses. So I anticipate that we'll really get involved in that probably in the summer.
Mm-hmm. And any pieces of the PATH Act that you want to share in terms of being an indication of your boss's top priorities for housing finance reform?
I think it's too early to tell. I think anyone who knows Chairman Hensling, he's a strong proponent of the private markets. He does not believe in a government-backed system, and so he will start from that particular perspective where he thinks, you know, that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should not have government backing. And so I think the challenge for us is creating a new housing finance system that doesn't disrupt the market, that over time market players can participate, and we just have to figure that out. I think that what will happen in this process is that the House will produce their bill, the Senate will produce theirs, and that's what a conference is for, is to kind of iron out the differences. But I don't foresee the House and Senate coming up with identical bills.
Me either. Theresa, anything you want to weigh in about housing finance reform and maybe what your boss is thinking about that?
Sure. I mean, I think you heard Clinton pretty loud and clear in terms of time frame. I mean, I think if PATH is the starting point, you know, our side of the aisle had serious concerns with that bill, including elimination of the trust fund. I can shout. We're back. And serious concerns about that FHA. I can shout. Okay, there we go. Back on. And, you know, serious.
I'm not cutting off her mic, so, you know.
You're behind this. You're behind. You know, serious concerns with the FHA provisions in PATH, among others. Clinton's right. We got a nice present, the HI subcommittee, in terms of having jurisdiction over the GSEs. And so we've got a number of staff on our side working on this from both the affordable housing side, which is very important to us, as well as the security side of GSE reform. So I think it's right, it's a little too early to tell. It's an important topic, and I think that, you know, our members have outlined a set of principles that, you know, I think is a starting point from our perspective, you know, preserving 30-year fixed rate mortgage, transparency, fair access, as Beth mentioned, you know, stability and liquidity, you know, all of those things. You know, the trust fund is very important to my boss and members on our side of the aisle, and so I think I would expect that those, you know, themes will continue to, you know, be important priorities for us.
So that's a good segue to talking about your boss's bill that she'll be introducing maybe today or.
Well, you know, I'll certainly let, you know, my boss is coming to speak to you all later on this evening, and I'll let her talk about her plans for her legislation. But, you know, homelessness remains, you know, incredibly important priority for her, and as part of that, you know, she's been a longtime champion of the National Housing Trust Fund. I think she sees the trust fund as an important component of, you know, eradicating sort of the rental housing crisis and addressing homelessness. So, you know, she'll continue to be a champion for that.
Great. And I also just wanted to move on to anti-poverty legislation. I know that Speaker Ryan and House Republicans put out a plan last June called A Better Way, where they talked about lots of different priorities, but one of them was anti-poverty legislation. And there's some pieces of it that the National Income Housing Coalition thinks are really great, and we'd love to work with your bosses on. But there are other parts that are, parts that we are really supportive of, is consolidating the administration of vouchers so that it's easier for people to use vouchers within an entire housing market as opposed to going through each particular PHA. But there are parts of it that are also very concerning to us about work requirements and time limits. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about timing for those sorts of changes. This is also for Theresa, Clinton, and Beth, if there's something going on the Senate side too. We could get a heads up.
So there were three components in, Speaker Ryan had a group of policy papers. One of them deals with anti-poverty initiatives. And there are three components related to housing. One addresses, and they're vague themes in the white paper, so I understand that. And a lot of folks had asked for legislation, but legislation has not been drafted. But they're concepts to put the ideas out there to actually see what the feedback would be and what the impact. So one of them is addressing the portability of vouchers. And really it's a takeoff from the Obama administration's proposal, I think in the last year's budget, to actually create a pilot program that would regionalize vouchers in a certain housing market or certain housing markets to test out ideas about metropolitan areas, I assume, that would have low-income folks who participate in the housing voucher program, deal with one waiting list, one administrator, hopefully in the idea that you could have these voucher recipients be able to move more easily within that market where they could go to better neighborhoods or places where there's greater educational opportunities. But we want to test that out. And so I think the first prong of that theme really came from that proposal. We even had a hearing on it, I think, in September to understand more, not only about that proposal, but what would it mean to maybe regionalize the administration of vouchers. Now, I expect that when we come back in the fall, after we've completed flood insurance, the Choice Act with Dodd-Frank, and housing finance reform, that's a plateful right there. But I expect that we would come back and address those particular issues. And so I can see that happening in late fall, early spring. I think last year the expectation is that it would start, we would be ready by June. In fact, my marching orders in October was to be ready by June. But I think they realized we would probably have a heart attack if we had to do everything at one time. The second is even vague, more vague, is to look at different models on how to house low-income folks. And we're really looking at the PHA system, okay? Is there a different way to address that? A different way to look at that structure? When we had hearings related to that, I think in May of last year, I think the word privatized came up a lot, but the hearing wasn't about privatizing public housing authorities. It was actually to explore what was happening in other countries, particularly in Great Britain, where they gave them a lot of flexibility to go out and be social entrepreneurs. They created them like hybrids between government and nonprofit. And there are some things that worked, and there are some things that didn't work, and I think we have to learn from those lessons. But the idea is that, you know, we read the tea leaves like everyone else. The budget numbers will be very tight, you know, going forward. And so we need to start preparing this system for what we think may happen 10 years from now, and what would that system look like. So that'll be that's the second prong. The third, and you've referenced that, is there was a reference to work requirements and time limits. We have a lot of members on our side of the aisle who are very interested in that. And I think the way the policy paper was written, we want to look at what are existing mechanisms out there for able-bodied working adults. We're not talking about elderly or disabled, but able-bodied, work-able adults Are they involved in other types of assistance programs where you already have these requirements? So is there an overlap? And if there is, we don't think that maybe you should have a one-size-fits-all. Maybe this is something that we can align with what's going on in the local area. What happens in Detroit and what can work in Detroit may not necessarily be something that works well in Alabama. And so we want to explore that issue. And so those are the themes. We haven't drafted legislation. I suspect that when we clear out the other priorities, then we'll spend a lot of time on this.
And I wanted to give Theresa a chance to weigh in there too about your reactions to that plan.
Now I probably want to turn off her mic. Okay.
Actually, I think that we, share a lot of the same questions and concerns around the affordability of vouchers. I think that's an area that, we're continuing to look at and, want to, oh, shoot. So, as I said, I think we share a lot of the, similar questions and potential concerns around the portability of vouchers. I think that's an area we'd like to continue to explore, and I know a lot of folks across the country are doing various, initiatives, and, we want to take a close look at that. Obviously when it comes to policy questions around work requirements and time limits, my boss has been very vocal in her position on sort of punitive approaches to those things. I think that we continue to have grave concerns about about what has been taking place in the Moving to Work program, not having a clear understanding of, some of the time limits and work requirements that have been enacted there in terms of the, impact on residents. They haven't been required to do any evaluations, and, so we don't have a lot of that data aggregated. I think that's, that's a huge flaw of that program, and I think a big barrier to us really understanding the impacts. So we'll continue to take a close look at that, but I think my boss has been very clear on that point, and I think that's the lens that we will take as we look at whatever legislation my counterparts end up pulling together. And we just have no sense of what that process is going to look like yet. As Clinton said, there is a lot on the plate with respect to priorities for the committee, and so we're just not there yet.
And then on the Senate side, I didn't know if there's any work that's being done as a counterpoint to that or a companion to that.
Well, I don't see it on our plate for this first little bit, as basically we share some of the same. We'll probably have some of the same workload, definitely the flood insurance piece. Poor Jason comes on these panels and we're always talking about flood insurance, and I guess you endure it very nicely, thank you. But we'll also have to do that, and it's got a deadline attached to it, as Jason said. We respond well to deadlines, so we'll be working on that. So we haven't, last Congress we didn't have a counterpart to this types of hearings they were talking about. One thing I think we'll want to make sure is that HUD actually is up and running and implementing a piece of legislation that was enacted last year that came out of the House side, the HOTMA legislation, because it had some really good things in it. We want to make sure it actually gets implemented now, so the community and housing authorities have a chance to take advantage of that too. So that'll all be ongoing as well.
Great. So I'm done with my questions, but I wanted to open it up to see if people have questions for the staffers. Don't be intimidated. These guys are really friendly. We'll start with Dara.
Hi, I'm Dara Baldwin, National Disability Rights Network, and a proud board member of the coalition. And thank you for all of your hard work and what you've been doing. Just a quick question in reference to getting FY17 done and then looking at FY18 and talking about sequestration and the caps and things that are going on there. If anyone wants to talk about that, and you don't have to. And then also, how do you see, or how do you think we can get advocates more comfortable with discussing budget and finance. I've finally now, people are calling me and saying, what's the difference between appropriations and budget? I don't think they kind of know that. And also how to talk about that with your bosses and other members at town hall meetings. Like if you have any resources for us to tell them, or if you have any wonderful young staffers who, you know, or interns who want to do that kind of work, I think it'd be nice if members started doing, I know you guys do a lot of stuff, but advocates are starting to look at this now when we've tried for years to say you have to look at the budget and the probes.
So I'll just jump in about the materials that we have for all of you. In your packets for tomorrow, we have some background information on what's happening on the appropriation side, the budget side, and what our ask to Congress is. But also when you guys get back to your states, we're sending out an email that looks forward to what's happening when Congress is on recess. And it'll give you sample questions that you could ask at town hall meetings, an advocacy toolkit with talking points and social media tweets that you can be using. And if there's anything that's not in there that would make it easier for you to talk to your local government officials about funding for affordable housing, you should let us know, and we're happy to put that together for you guys.
Let me just add something that has nothing to do with the budget, but about advocacy. I would strongly recommend that you go and visit the members in your districts. And I'll speak on the Republican side. There tends to be a tendency, not at the national level here, because we always hear from this organization on the national level, and I think we have a good working relationship. But I always get the sense that at the local level, a lot of the Republican members don't get the visits. And I can tell by the type of questions they ask when we're doing presentations and going through legislation. And then I can tell the ones who are getting the visits because the question is actually much different. And they're talking about specific projects, or this is what's happening in my district. So I know they're getting visits from local advocates who are sensitizing them to the impact of a program and how effective it is. And so, so this is a partisan statement, but I would hope that you go and visit the Republican members as well, because they need to understand what these programs mean in their districts and who they impact. And I don't think enough of that happens.
I think I would just, add to that. I mean, do not underestimate the importance of your voice here in DC and in your communities. I think we need to know, our members need to know, our bosses need to know what's working, what's not working. I think we hear from the national groups all of the time. We hear from local electeds. We hear from housing authorities and trade associations, and we don't hear enough from the residents. And I think that's an important voice that our bosses need to continue to hear on both sides of the aisle. I think as you are hearing the robust amount of things on our agenda that we need to tackle, these are really important issues that require your voice at the table. So I just echo that.
Maybe this woman right here, the blue pink jacket.
My question is, in appropriations on the proposed budget for public housing, will the percentage go down? If so, do you see about how much it would go down?
In terms of the pro rata for the operating and capital fund? For what we're talking about for 18? I mean, it really remains to be seen. I mean, I don't know what kind of allocation full committee is going to give the THUD subcommittee to do its work. We have transportation priorities, we have housing priorities, and without knowing sort of what that number is, I couldn't commit to anyone right now what a pro rata for 18 would look like. I mean, on the operating fund, we're very cognizant of the importance of funding the operating fund. The pro rata has been anywhere between 80 and 90% the last few years. The downward pressure means that we're probably going to be a really heavy lift to see 100%, but we continue to try and do the best that we can.
But the fact that we don't know is the reason why we're trying to work as hard as we can to talk to members of Congress about why public housing is so important and why they need these resources. And so that's a really good message for you to be sharing with your members of Congress. You know, Jason will sort out the details when he gets his allocation of what funding he has to put where, but it's really our job to be sending a message to Congress that we need to fully fund these programs and that we can't see any further cuts to it. And so that's really what our job is when we go back to our districts and when we're working with members of Congress on the Hill to put as much pressure on them as possible to fully fund these programs. Sorry, Jason.
No, exactly. I mean, I'll just add that the subcommittee has a deadline of April 6th to receive member request letters. The House subcommittee's deadline was April 4th, so that'd be tomorrow. You guys are on the Hill. Make the most of it.
You think
I can take
that
your
means-
question too.
You're right.
Okay. I understand. You know me though. So my question is, that's right. So my question is, I'm Demetrius Bonner. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I'm the Vice President of the North Region for the National Alliance of HUD Tenants. And my question to you is, when will you enforce the right for tenants to have a right to return to where their homes was demolished? I don't know if you're aware that 5 miles of public housing, not including Cabrini Green, but just 5 miles of the State Street Corridor was demolished. Millions of tenants and parents and families were displaced. Now they're privatizing those communities. What are you going to do to provide a safe, decent place and a right to return for those people who are illegally displaced?
That'd be me.
Authorizing?
Appropriators.
I think I'm drawing the straw here. So I am familiar with State Street. I worked in Chicago in 1986 when Harold Washington was mayor. But I'm from North Carolina, so it was my first introduction to urban public housing. In fact, I think because of that experience, when I came on the Hill, I got members to go out to Chicago to see that because I had never seen something, like that. Now, I think there are a lot of issues with what's going on in Chicago and the Housing Authority. All right, so I understand that is one issue. There's a couple of other issues also, and Sheila Crowley, who used to head this organization, has reminded me every now and then, and I've gotten those emails and read those articles. I'll be up front. I haven't heard much of, or there hasn't been much of an urgency here for us to do something specific in Chicago. But I think there is a question about one-to-one replacement of units and what that means. How are we housing folks, and how are we, after we do supposedly great renovation or rehabilitation or just redevelopment, what does that mean for the residents who were displaced and how and when they can come back? I love to tell the story of in New Orleans years ago. I was there for something separate, but I decided, hey, I'd like to do a tour of public housing, and so the local authority at the time did that, and they were very proud of the fact that they were tearing down this building. I'm just making up the numbers, but this whole development had about 800 units in it, and they were going to tear it down. And when they rebuild it, I think it was going to be like 400 units. And I asked the question, well, what happens to the other 400? And I never really got a good answer, and it's always influenced, I'm not sure the market can absorb all that. So I think there is a sensitivity on our side to that issue, and I'll make this commitment as a staff person, not for the committee or the person, but when we start looking at these issues in earnest, I'd like to work with Theresa and kind of address that issue, because I think I'm very sensitive to that. All right, so I don't have an immediate answer for you, but I'm glad you raised it, because I hope Theresa can vouch for me. If I say we're going to work on it, we'll talk about that.
Sure. So you do raise a really important issue, and I'll, in terms of the challenges with Section 18, demo dispo process, with, Old Hope 6, and some of the challenges there with, rescreening, one-for-one replacement. You know, my boss has a comprehensive public housing bill out there that completely rewrites the demo dispo process, that really puts teeth into the resident rights and ensuring no rescreening, ensuring one-for-one replacement. I think that Choice Neighborhoods has tried to do a lot of some of that to really rectify some of the deficiencies in Hope 6 with respect to resident rights, but we're not there yet, and what you're highlighting sort of amplifies that. And I think, you know, I expect that, you know, public housing is going to continue to be an important priority for the boss with respect to long-term affordability, with respect to the resident rights concerns that you have raised, and it's important, and again, like, important for you to continue to educate your members of Congress and folks about what is happening on the ground and what does need to be changed, because these are important issues and are difficult to elevate in the myriad priorities that our bosses and all of the members of Congress who, you know, you all, you know, represent in terms of your districts, you know, have to grapple with every day.
But I do want to go back to, I think what the question raises, and my response, and Theresa, and not to spend too much more time on it, because I'd love to come back to another conference and talk about it more, but, you know, I question whether the public housing model is the right model. Okay, I think we have an obligation, and we have made investments in affordable housing. I'm just not sure this is the right model anymore. And I think part of the discussion that we need to have in the fall is, what does that mean, and what are the implications for that?
It was the right model. It was the lack of enforcement by CHN and people in power, the congressmen, who didn't enforce the regulations as they were in the protection of the tenants that were there. There was no protection for them. They didn't repair stuff, just like they did Pruitt-Igoe. They stopped doing the repairs, and then it made it too costly to repair. So it's about holding the people who sits in authority to make those decisions to keep those places not affordable, but low income. Because when you use the term affordable, it's not affordable if you can't afford it. That's right. So let's be realistic about this issue.
All right, we'll have to end there because we're running a little bit over time. I'm sorry about that, but good question. If we could, a round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you so much for coming out.